We'll figure it out. I hope everyone can see me. Hello everyone. Kurz erstmal auf Deutsch, Valeria. Herzlich willkommen zum heutigen Trace-Vortrag. Oh, you have to. Herzlich willkommen zum heutigen Trace-Vortrag. Wir haben heute Dr. Valeria Lazarenko zu Gast. Sie ist Postdoktorandin am Georg-Simmel-Zentrum für Urban Studies an der Humboldt-Universität. Sie ist auch assoziierte Forscherin am SFB Affektive Gesellschaften und in ihrer Forschung konzentriert sie sich vor allem auf Affekte und Emotionen, die mit Erfahrungen von erzwungener Migration, Integration und transnationaler Beziehung verbunden sind. Der Vortrag heute findet auf Englisch statt, deswegen wechsle ich jetzt gleich auch zu Englisch. Welcome everyone. Today we have Dr. Valeria Lazarenko as a guest speaker for our TRACE lecture. She is a postdoctoral researcher at the Georg Simmel Center for Urban Studies and is also an associated researcher at the SFB Center for Affective Societies, where she works primarily on emotions and effects, and has worked extensively in her research until today on emotions related to forced migration, integration, and transnational relations. We are very happy to have her here with the talk on ethical knowledge production about the Russia-Ukraine war, and to hear her insights from a very positioned researcher. We look forward to you, and the floor is yours, Valeria.
Thank you, Miranda. Thank you for introduction. Thank you for inviting me here. It's my first time in Darmstadt, not first time in Hessen, but the last time I was in Hessen was, I would say, 11 years ago. It's great to be here with this beautiful weather and beautiful surroundings. And today I will is it okay with the sound? Okay, because I can hear myself very loudly. It's a bit weird. Today I will, this talk is based on a recent paper that I have published together with my colleague Marnie Hollett from the University of Oxford. And and is vastly based on my personal experience of being a very positioned researcher in the context of ongoing Russia-Ukraine war, because I'm from Ukraine and I was living in Ukraine when the full-scale war has started on 24th of February 2022. At that moment, I just finished my PhD and was working as a researcher in a independent NGO think tank, SEDOS. And we were working with many, mostly working on social issues. And 2 days before the onset of full-scale war, we just finished our project about homelessness in Ukrainian cities and towns. And we were about to prepare the report on this project, and then the full-scale war has started, and we were a bit unsure, should we publish this data, or is it relevant to think about that to solve the problem of homelessness when millions of people suddenly become homeless and when this problem just gets to another scale. And so what we did, we made another research. We created kind of a survey. I will speak a bit later about this. And during the second week of the full-scale invasion to Ukraine, we, a team of 8 people shredded around the country, some are already migrated abroad, we made a research and surveyed the experience, the actions, thoughts, and feelings of people in Ukraine living through this situation. Because in that moment, and also, I don't know how my colleagues came up with the idea that we should do this research, because what I recall, I was, for some time, I was outside in a bomb shelter or elsewhere, and then I came back to the internet and connected with my colleagues. They were already discussing that, we are doing a survey, and they have appointed me as a leader of that project. So, and of course, in that moment, it was a perfect distraction from the things happening around. And at least if you are able to focus on something work related, that was very valuable. Not to say that communication with the colleagues was also extremely important at that moment, as our working project chats became the network of support between the people who we know well and with whom we work very closely. And so we made this research, and we didn't have any time to think about how to do it methodologically correctly. We just were in that moment, in that feeling that the only thing we as researchers can do is to do a research right now and to collect this data, because it is something extremely valuable. And especially when like the whole world of Ukrainians is just breaking into little pieces, that was a unique experience and a unique historic event. And also we didn't have much time analyzing this research. But when we started presenting this research already in April 2022, so less than a month, a bit more than a month after the outbreak of full-scale war, we got lots of questions from the audience in European universities where we presented the research. How did you do it? How did you come with the idea? What were your ethical considerations when you were doing that? So we started discussing this methodological stuff a bit afterwards, like a post factum, post-publishing. And from these discussions, came up this paper and this topic, and the overall idea of speaking about this, thinking about this, and conceptualizing the role of the researchers in the time of the full-scale war. And the experience of my colleague Marnie Hollet, my co-author, is very different. Her name doesn't sound Ukrainian, but she is Ukrainian originally. She's from Canada, and ethnic Ukrainian from Canada working at the University of Oxford. And she also had a project about Ukraine at that moment that was ongoing. But when the full-scale war started, that project just became irrelevant, absolutely irrelevant. So she also had this experience of switching her research focus on studying the acute experience of the war. And that's how we wrote the paper. And in today's presentation, okay, it works. Yeah, these are the most pending questions for me, because as millions of people have been displaced, grassroots situation fundamentally changed, accessing people, sites, and materials has become exceptionally complicated. And as I already mentioned, many topics also become temporarily irrelevant or even inappropriate to study. Like the language conflicts in Ukraine or something like that. That was kind of an interesting topic before the full-scale war. But much social science research has continued since Russia's invasion in an attempt to uncover the full experience of the war. And that's why this creates a very specific situation, specific set of ethical and methodological challenges, which are not unique for this particular conflict and can be also extrapolated onto studying other ongoing conflicts that unfortunately are happening in our world. But yeah, this gives some insights and some examples of what we can do and how can we critically assess the knowledge production. I will refer a lot to the concept of knowledge production, and by this I follow the notions of another colleagues with whom we made an edited volume about this whole topic, Olga Burlyuk and Vjosa Musiolu. And they define knowledge production as the conglomerate of research, publication, citation, teaching, policy engagement, and public engagement. So everything around not only the research stuff, but also not only how we do the research, but also how do we communicate the research, and what impact can our research, and by our I mean the social scientists, political scientists, everyone who is doing something and publishing something and declaring some opinion about the ongoing war. And yeah, I will refer to mostly to two research projects. The one of Sedos think tank, that I mentioned that we have done at the from 2nd to 7th of March 2022. That was the time framework for the field work. With we had a focus on the impacts the war had on civilian population, and at that moment we aimed at documenting people's experiences, thoughts, and feelings during the first weeks of the war. We collected. We had around 45 questions in our survey. But it's hard to assess, and most of the questions it included demographic block and also open-ended questions where people could share their thoughts and opinions about and also describe their experiences. And in that research, we gathered answers of 555 people during 5 days. The survey was distributed through, it was made fully online and on a platform of Google Forms. Because we unfortunately didn't have time. We didn't think about that at that moment as about data storage and everything. We just did the research in the only way we could do it. So it was a Google form that was distributed mostly through social media on the pages of Sedos think tank and through personal social media of the research team. So mostly Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. And so that's why it was also a huge question about the representativeness of our research, and we acknowledge it in the foreword to our report that we understand that we're only able to collect the answers of people who firstly use social media, secondly had 20 minutes to fill in the questionnaire, and thirdly had basic access to the internet at certain points of time. So but it was still a research with certain results, which is absolutely qualitative, even though it takes the form of a quantitative survey, but we didn't do any numbers. And we also, as a team, have done follow-up surveys 3 months after the outbreak of full-scale war, 6 months, 1 year, and 2 years. But I was only part of the team for the first 2 iterations. And then I moved to Humboldt University of Berlin, and my colleagues continued working on that. But I will still use some examples from their work. And the second research project that I will also refer to is what I'm doing now in Georg Simmel Center for Urban Studies, Humboldt University of Berlin. I am, I didn't mention, now I identify as anthropologist, not sociologist, and not political scientist. And I'm doing an anthropological project with a key question of how and why Ukrainian refugee women make decision to remain in Germany in a long-term perspective. And what I do, I follow the lives of 12 Ukrainian single women who have moved to Berlin. I only focus on Berlin because I have a very limited resources, and Germany is a very federal state, and comparing policies and situations in different federal lands, it's just too much for one person to conduct. So my informants are all based in Berlin, and they arrived to the city in February till April 2022. I started this research in June 22, and I'm still doing it. And so I follow the lives of these women, which means we have repeated interviews, but also contact each other in the meantime, like following each other on the social media. And they contact me a lot because they see me as their contact point with life in Germany, including bureaucracy issues, housing issues, and just some other issues. And my thematic foci are bureaucracy, housing, and anchoring, like adaptation to the urban context. So these are the 2 projects to which I will refer a lot while speaking about these 3 groups of key challenges to ethical knowledge production, like ethical challenges, responsibilities of academics when researching traumatic events, methodological deliberations involved in collecting data in dynamic and time-sensitive environments, and ensuring ethical, rigorous, and transparent research despite the circumstances, and outlining epistemological positions as researchers producing knowledge about a lived reality from which we are removed. And by this, I mean the situation where researchers find themselves, we find ourselves, when we are both living this reality of being a person in a war country, or being a refugee researcher like I am, or being just personally very much involved, having families and relatives in Ukraine. And this idea of transforming the traumatic experience of our own and of our close one into research material is something very uneasy to think about it, but I'm trying to do that. And in the paper I'm presenting today, I quote from anthropologist Lee and Fuji, that we must remind ourselves that to enter another's world as a researcher is a privilege, not a right. And unfortunately, I have also encountered many other research pieces and many other research approaches. As a Ukrainian refugee living in Germany, I'm also targeted on social media with invitations to take part in some questionnaires and in some research. And I'll not mention any of the colleagues, but I've seen very interesting ways to engage people into the research. And sometimes, at some cases, some researchers just take this thing for granted, that they can just go and ask anyone about anything. And I had that experience that I was scrolling Facebook in the evening, clicking on the link to participate in some research, and there were directly questions like, do you recall the events of the last half a year? Yes, I do. What was the most traumatic events for you in the last 6 months? And I was like, interesting question. And you're just not ready to do that, especially if research situation is like that, if it is distributed through social media, and the questionnaire just make you dive into all the most traumatic experience. Yeah, this was also a point for me to think about all this ethical thing. And also, it is completely understandable that for many researchers, for many people, the need to collect knowledge and to gather this information is just prioritizing over the ethical considerations. And that's why we as researchers must weigh the sense of urgency in conceptualizing the events, and just be sensitive. However, there is sorry. There are also some things that are hardly relatable, or might be hard relatable for the people who are out of the context, or on the other hand, might seem obvious for people who are inside the context, but hard, and what I mean is the positionality of researchers as insiders or outsiders. In classical political science, from my previous research experience, I remember while working on my master's in part of my PhD project and master's in peace studies, there was a strong statement from the academic advisors that we must not use as a field, some region or period or something that is very personally related, because that biases the objectivity of producing scientific knowledge. Luckily, in anthropology, we don't have it, and we can do it, but it's still a little bit doubted. Is it really a good practice? But in my case, I just didn't have any other choice but to research what is a bit painful for me, but also that much important for me. But of course, in this case, I clearly acknowledge my positionality of being insider in the field. And this helps a lot, of course, because when I'm doing my field work, when I'm recruiting these 12 women from Ukraine to participate in my research and share the stories, their life stories, they feel that somehow I am the same. I had the same things, not the same, but I also crossed the border. I also left my family behind. And yeah, but the biggest challenge here of being insider is the overwhelming sense of empathy and the great danger and the great research pitfall of being too empathetic to the research informants, and also not being, somehow omitting the boundaries between researcher and informant, which sometimes is not easy to do. Like in one case, when I was doing a first interview with one of my informants in Berlin, she is actually the woman of my age who also migrated from the city of Kiev at the same time, and kind of similar life story. And somehow we met for coffee at like 4 p.m., I think, somewhere in Berlin. And this was the interview that lasted for 4 hours or 4.5, because at some point the person just suggested that, oh, why are we drinking coffee? Let's just switch to wine. Like, I'm at work, but that was also a challenging experience, because like I'm already in contact with this person, and it is also not ethical to just stop the person in this situation when she is willing to share her story and when she feels the need to express herself. So yeah, that was the interview for 4.5 hours, and the hardest part of it was to put everything that I collected into the field notes and structure it somehow and do something with that. But of course, this position of insider leads to blind spots in research, as we might just omit some things by over-identifying or even over-interpreting the research results through the lens of our personal experience, which could, I'll speak about this later. For the outsiders, like those who didn't experience it themselves, like don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the outsiders cannot do research about sensitive environment, but what I see as the most profitable strategy, at least from my experience, is the combination of positions of insiders and outsiders, of having a team of people who are emotionally involved and people who can be the peer reviewers and just say and point out to the thing like, hey, here, maybe you're just getting too emotional, and or even helping with reading through the material, reading through the field notes to assess if everything is coded or interpreted in a more or less rigorous way. But yeah, these shared experiences between the researchers and the research informant, as I already said, can of course lead to mutual understanding, facilitate connections, and also sense of safety for respondents. But and also can provide the participants with a sense of empowerment, as the very idea of sharing the story with someone who understands, and also, like in my case, it is the understanding in terms of speaking mutual language. It already gives the informant this feeling that their story matters, that their life experience are important, that their life experience matter. And of course, in case of my ongoing project, when I approach people and ask them to complain to me about German bureaucracy, this creates lots of like trust, because they see that I'm also going through all the same things. I'm also submitting documents in Landesamt for foreigners, and going through all of these, because this is something that people not easily disclose to a person, for instance, representing German institution, as it is a topic for another talk. But since personal sentiments and feelings might hardly be separated from the research itself, such situation creates the huge need of peer reviewing. And this is what we have done in our team in CEDOS, in our team of 8 people that we created. It was also there are not much literature and textbooks on how to conduct a research in a conflict environment. So some of the things, and also we didn't have time and access to everything, to check everything on site. So we had some ideas how to make this, how to overcome this potential over-identification with the responses we got. So, and also how not to re-traumatize the researchers. We just shared the answers to our open-ended questions in the surveys between the people in that way that a person who had some particular experience didn't, and I, as a manager of a team, knew, of course, where my colleagues were, what they were going through. Like, for instance, a person who had very traumatic experience of crossing the border at the beginning of the full-scale war with these evacuation trains and lots of people and standing the whole night long on the border in cold at night, she was just not working with that set of questions, and she was working on the other dimensions. While these experiences of traveling and evacuation were given to a person who remained at her home. And yeah, this peer reviewing was also very helpful here. And but the most interesting ethical question to me is the question of trust and rapport. How do we make, first thing, in like more person-to-person settings like interviews, the position of insider helps a lot to create this trust. But what in case of a survey distributed online? In classical literature on conducting the research in war and conflict environments under the pressure, it is usually suspected that such environments create challenges for recruitment and sampling, as the population is very hard to reach or even marginalized. And that's why the response rate for research is usually much lower than expected. But what we had in CEDOS, 555 people in 5 days. This is a very high number for any research. And we were surprised that our research, it was just on social media that people were reposting it. People who participated in this anonymously even, but we've seen all these mentions of us on Facebook that people were like, oh, that's a cool research. And we had also kind of a feedback form at the end of our survey where people were able to leave their comments or ask for help or whatever. And we had their feedback like, thank you very much. It was so important for me to fill in this questionnaire. Or, thank you, I was able to distract myself from from thinking of the events outside by just filling in this survey. And also this idea of, so the world can know my story. That's how people feel about this opportunity to share. Of course, not not all of them, it also varies. But also, this was surprising for us. And we worked, in the next iterations of the survey, we worked even more on the opening message, how to explain people who are we, why are we collecting this information, so people could just trust us and that we are not going to ask for any personal data or whatever. However, we also had some questions and comments, like, why are we doing that? For instance, we had a question somewhere inside the survey, we had a question about the evacuation and like, did you move from your original town, and which means of transportation did you use, and to which destination did you move? And on the second week of the full-scale war, these questions sounded a bit suspicious for some people, because like, why are we collecting this information? Maybe we are spies who are just trying to disclose some evacuation routes of Ukrainians. Who knows? And because of course, in this total atmosphere of fear and distrust and stress, people are also getting suspicious sometimes. Another question we got quite often was the question of financing. Who is paying for that? Who is the financing body for this research, and with whom will we share our data? And yeah, we communicated this all through our social media pages that we are independent think tank, and this project is not financed by anyone. It is, and we are just using the institutional grant funding to conduct this survey, but we are not sharing this data. But it's also, yeah, question of trust is very interesting. Another experiences I heard from, sorry, I didn't change the slide here. Another experience I heard from researchers, colleagues already in Germany, was about another survey about early experiences of refugees in Germany, which was published by a German institution. And at the beginning, the participant could choose the language in which to go on. So it was German, English, Ukrainian, and Russian, which is understandably a language that most of people who came from Ukraine can speak fluently, but it also creates some questions. Why Russian? Who did this research? Who are collecting this material? And in that research, in that case, the colleagues shared with me that the response rate was quite low on that case. Yeah, and of course, also the question of disclosing the information. This is more attributed to my research, my small research project in Berlin, that even though it is very important to build the trust and this good connection with the informant, some people are still quite aware of what are they sharing. And for me, it's always extremely crucial to communicate with my informant that you can always ask me to do some things off the record and to just quit from recording. And of course, the moment where I stop recording, it's usually just the beginning of the real interview, as people feel much freely to share this. But I had one case, two persons deliberately asked me not to record their answers at all, because they were aware of their own personal situation and that it might affect them. And I'll come back to this point a bit later by the end of the presentation. But yeah, besides that, besides the responsibility to our informants and protecting them and not to over disclosing their stories, it is also super important to be responsible to ourselves as researchers. And Yeah, this is what I already mentioned about peer reviewing, collaborating, delegating tasks, dividing challenging topics across the team, and creating safe space for team members to debrief and discuss the challenging aspects. With our research in status, we just had a team meeting every Friday when we were just discussing how was the work this week, what was the most challenging, what can we improve. And at the end, I already quit the project by the time, but my colleagues also on one of those meetings decided that probably it will be important to invite some external psychologists who will help them to debrief all this heavy load of very heavy material in their professional life. Methodological challenges. Here I will be very brief and mostly concentrate on one issue, the issue of time. And the question, where is the right time to do the research? And how do we find balance between ad hoc projects and methodological clearness? Because what we did in CEDAS, it was very much ad hoc, very much drafted. And but we were able to do that research because we were not the university, because we were a think tank. We didn't have the control, that much of control from the outside, and we didn't have an ethical committee. And this is a story that my colleague Marnie Hollett told me. It's her anecdote, and she works in Britain. And when the full-scale war started, she didn't have any choice but to apply for ethical commission to permit her to do the research the way she wanted. She got the response from ethical committee in 3 months. It is the same in Germany. It is the same in Humboldt University of Berlin, where our ethical commission has meetings every 2 months. So you just cannot do anything faster than that because you need the approval. And in Marnie's case, the questionnaire they prepared, it just became irrelevant by the time the project was approved. And the only thing to do was to go to the ethical committee again, because you cannot go to the field without this. And secondly, the ethical committee, it's coming back to the point of insiders and outsiders. The ethical committee mostly consists from people who are very far from particular fields they are assessing. So she got the positive review of her ethical committee and then gave this survey she prepared to her Ukrainian friend, who opened it and started crying at some point, because there was a question about planning the future, and this was formulated in quite sensitive way in terms of language, in terms of choose of the wordings, because like in English, everything sounded perfect, but the choose of the wording in Ukrainian was quite triggering. So even the approval from ethical committee doesn't mean anything. You can waste so much time and still do something that is potentially traumatizing for the researchers. And I was so impressed by this story. It's some of the things that's so hard to assess. And it is, of course, a question, who is deciding what is good to ask, what is not good to ask, and where is the right time to do the research. When I was doing my PhD project, I was focusing on internally displaced people in Ukraine, and my time distance from the traumatic event in their lives was 3 to 4 years. But I still got questions about, was it the right time? Was it the appropriate time to work with this topic? And my answer would be that there is never appropriate time, and there is also always an appropriate time to do such research if to do it in an ethical way and prioritize ethics over the general idea of producing knowledge. Another question is the reproducibility of the data, but maybe I'll not stop on this because, of course, it is even not a question. No, the data is not reproducible when the situation is changing so much. So we just cannot do it in a perfect way. what is more interesting for me is the question about what do we include in our research? Because and who do we represent and who we do not represent in our research? Because also with the time constraints and with the general limitations for the publication, like the desirable size of research reports in 20 to 40 pages, or the size of academic paper of 8,000 words, we cannot include everything. And here comes a question of a moral choice for the researchers. What do we include? Which quotes will illustrate what? And from here, there is a TED talk by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie about the power of a single story. And it is kind of a pitfall where we can very easily fall by choosing the stories that are the most dramatic, the most interesting, instead of representing some real life things. Or, this moral choice of the researchers is a topic somewhere very, very close to the issue of self-censorship. Because on one hand, we have this question of whom do we represent and whom do we not represent and why. And with this thing, I will also come back to this a bit later when wrapping up all this story because before I need to mention about the epistemological challenges and the general ideas of knowledge production. No, this I should skip. Yeah, I have already spoken about the sensitivity to the readership, about the sensitivity to the research team, but there is also such thing as sensitivity to the readership. Coming back to this question of censorship and self-censorship and representation, misrepresentation, it is a very crucial question. For whom do we produce the knowledge? And here I mean not only the research, but also the more open publications, presentations, talks, and so on. And in CEDOS, when we were about to publish our first report on the first day's full-scale war, we decided to publish it firstly in Ukrainian and then translate it to English for the outer world. And while doing that, we had a very interesting discussion inside our team. Should we just translate everything? Because it started with the fact that some things we just needed to include lots of footnotes to explain some points in the quotes that are not easily read when the person is not in the context. So we were thinking, oh, maybe we can just choose another quote which requires less space with the footnotes. But then we started thinking about that it will change the report and it can change a tone of voice. It can change what we represent, what we do not represent. And here comes the question of our responsibility as researchers in forming the general knowledge about the thing, about the situation. And another issue is balancing the emotional and the analytical. Like, as Ukrainians, of course, we want the world to know about the really bad things that are happening in the country. And there is some kind of, I felt it myself a lot, there is some kind of the desire to show these some painful situations, some like bad treatment or even traumatic events, to draw attention to the problem that is very acute for us. But I also must remain a researcher, a professional, and separate my emotions from what I'm doing. And it is a very interesting exercise. But also, yeah, coming back to this idea, for whom do we publish, the situation that happened quite recently for me was about one of my research informants in Berlin. She is living, I'm now writing about housing and housing housing crisis in Berlin, and the challenges for Ukrainians, because it's quite hard to find any suitable accommodation if you have Ukrainian documents. Long story. So the person had some very unpleasant situation with her landlady. And I have already spoken about that on academic events, about that precise case, because it is very illustrative case of household exploitation of a young person by the older person who is in power of providing housing. And I have spoken about this on the events. I have written about this in academic publications. And then I was approached by Die Zeit to write a column for them. And when I was writing for Die Zeit, I had to stop myself from disclosing this story, because suddenly I realized that the landlady described in the story is literally the readership of that newspaper. And if she recognizes herself in that story, that might cause real troubles for a person whom I interviewed. And that's absolutely not what I want. So yeah, I postponed my publication in Die Zeit, and I'm thinking how to change. If I change genders in this story, it will get even worse. And maybe someone else will recognize themselves, which is also not a nice thing. But yeah, maybe I'll just omit this story because it can be recognizable. And yeah, and the same goes for the the anonymization strategies of that we are doing, and also thinking about the future of our publications, because what we are doing, like our reports, our presentations, our talks, like lectures that will remain on YouTube probably forever, what will be the impact of what we say now in a couple of years? We always say in all the consent forms for the interviews that the person has a right to withdraw their participation in the research by just addressing me via email. But how it is possible in the world where everything is published? I have no idea. We have this requirement in Germany to have this, but if the story is already published and distributed in some journals or shared in Die Zeit, what can a person do? And this is also something we need to think about. I don't know. I don't have any answers for all of these questions, how to do it, how to disseminate my research outcomes in that way that it will not re-traumatize my participants 10 years after this moment, when they will suddenly come across their quotes from the first months after the beginning of the full-scale war. And the last point I wanted to address is in this talk is also the positionality and role of the researchers as of people who can impact the public opinion and in some cases, even the overall geopolitical situation. If to think bigger, like by forming the opinion about the war in Ukraine, about the need to help refugees, outreaching to the stakeholders, to the decision makers. It is quite a thing, especially if you are a white male professor from a very renowned university. And it is thus incredibly important for us to recognize the power we hold in understanding, in shaping understandings of the war. And here comes the question of who has a right to speak about this, who has a right to produce the knowledge. And I especially like this quote from a blog post by Neil Abrams. Dear illustrious professors of international relations, stop talking about Ukraine. Seriously, it's time to sit down and shut up. This blog post was written in April 2023 after some conference at United States in international relations dedicated to the issues of geopolitics and so on, where everyone suddenly became an expert on Ukraine. And that was kind of a thing in 2022, when I just arrived here. There was lots of demand on information about Ukraine because, it's a question that's like not much people know about the country. But suddenly lots of people who were previously experts on Russia, on Cold War, on former Soviet Union, on Poland, on Turkey, they all started commenting things about Ukraine. And their position in power, their position as professors of the leading universities made their opinion more valuable. I remember when everyone was quoting Noam Chomsky, who had nothing to do with Ukraine and who is in his very respectable age, speaking about world peace and something, okay. Or Henry Kissinger, or who else? David Harvey, geographer, also made his statement about Ukraine. That was quite interesting because, of course, everyone retweets what they say, not what many shredded teams of Ukrainian academic researchers with knowledge about the subject can share. No, that's not about that. And in this context, I also had this experience that once I was firstly invited to participate in a discussion about Ukraine, but then I was still in Ukraine at the time, and I mentioned that, I'm not sure if I will have electricity at that moment. And then I realized that, no, I'm not invited to the event anymore because there are 4 distinguished white male professors who have much more to say about Ukraine, even though they have never been in the country. So this is a thing. And the problem that we have faced as SEDOS also, while presenting this research, was that we were treated like as the source of data, that the researchers who are based in Ukraine or who are Ukrainians working based in migrant community, they are rather providing data from the field to the others who will conceptualize it and work on it. And this creates, a very tangible imbalance of power. But also I'm extremely proud of many of my colleagues who are doing this now, who are challenging these hierarchies of knowledge production and thinking about not knowledge production, but knowledge co-production and doing collaborative research, combining both perspectives of insiders and outsiders, including Ukrainian researchers who have the lived experiences of this, and especially including those researchers who are still based in Ukraine, because lots of things are going on there. Lots of researchers just didn't want to go anywhere, and they feel that their place is there, but they have much worse outreach to the world community. And so for me personally, it's super important to see Ukrainian researchers as practice partners, not the suppliers of empirical data, and as equal knowledge producers. But of course, treating people for their expertise in the field, not for the fact that they are Ukrainians. Also, my experience, April 2022, I'm just new in Berlin, and I get invitation to participate in discussions everywhere. At some point, I'm on a discussion about some ecological reconstruction of mining, coal mining things in Ukraine. And at that point, I realized it's, probably I'm invited because I'm Ukrainian, not because I'm an expert in my particular field. And I was thinking that if I was specializing in biophysics, would I still be invited to such discussions? Probably not. But this is a thing that I see a major influx of Ukrainian scholars in German academia, in British academia now. And this is probably a moment where like refugee scholars can also speak about themselves, but also include the perspective of those who remained in the country. And I will end my talk with this quite speculative thought we had in our paper about the right to remain silent. It was the idea of my co-author mostly that some people just should not do the research if they cannot prioritize research ethics over the production of knowledge. But to me, it is also about our own rights as a researcher to remain silent and not to do it when like it is the only thing you're trained to do and it is the only thing you can do. But also, I would like to finish the talk with these thoughts about the way that we as researchers can impact the public opinion also by choosing our research topics. And of course, now I see so many articles, so many publications, so many art exhibitions about the suffering of Ukrainian people. And yes, it is very painful, but it is also forming a narrative of perpetual victim. And for the community, probably it is, and I'm very much looking forward to more papers, exhibitions, talks, lectures about, for instance, narratives about agency and resilience, stories about how Ukrainians are still resisting, stories about how people are finding some good things despite everything, and research projects about Ukrainian activism, or not only Ukrainian, I'm speaking a lot about Ukraine because like this is where I come from, but of course it can be extrapolated also to other migrant communities, other minorities, and also their activism. And even the research projects about that, to my opinion, can still be a valuable contribution to this change of subject from perpetual victim to the narratives of agency and resilience. And I have been talking for more than an hour, so I should stop right now at this point. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer the questions.
Open the floor for questions. I'd say both in English and in German, and then we'll translate.
Hi. You said in the beginning that the results of the survey had the limitation of access for some people, like people not having internet access or something. How do you think the results would have changed if everyone had access?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, thank you for your question. I didn't speak much about the results of that research, but yeah, we just collected these thoughts. And I would say that if everyone had, like, we didn't include mostly elderly people, people from small villages and small towns, and people on temporary occupied territories. So I would say we would have more answers from those people who didn't move, who have chosen to remain at the place where they were settled before, and who were maybe more fatalistic and less active. But I don't know. It's hard to suggest, to think about that. But yeah, maybe it will impact the results in these topics and in the questions concerning like the fear of leaving home and the home attachment, maybe also for those who have stayed, mostly like that.
Thank you.
Maybe it's a silly question. You told us about the methods you did your research, but I couldn't learn about the questions you asked the people, the content of your research. I didn't see the point.
Mhm.
Isn't it necessary to tell about the kind of not only the kind of questions, but the content of the questions you asked?
Yeah, thank you. I didn't want to put too much time on this, but we had blogs about experience, thoughts, and feelings during the first weeks of the full-scale war. So the questionnaire started with questions: where have you been when the full-scale war have started? What were your first thoughts? What were your first actions? Then there was a block about moving between, like, did you stay in the same place as you were, or did you move? If so, by which means and where? Then about, like, it was like opening part of the question. If yes, where are you staying now? And do you have supplies of anything? After that, there was also questions about communications. Which means of communications are you using to contact with other people? Question about emotional state, a block of questions about emotional state. Also, questions about like, did you feel that any of your beliefs have changed since the beginning of the full-scale war? And here we got many interesting questions that were also a thing of a point of consideration for us, whether to disclose it or no. Because, for instance, many people were responding that, yes, my beliefs have changed. Like, I have been a very pacifistic person and a vegetarian for many years, but now I'm so full of anger towards what is happening, so I have started to consume meat again. That was a perfect answer. So, and there were also questions like that people felt lots of, about the changes in behavior, emotions, and values and ideas, if I translated correctly. Emotional states and plans for the future. So it was structured like that in all the waves, all the iterations. And the full report is published in English. Maybe it is possible to somehow disseminate it. Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much for the talk. I have two questions. The first is rather short. How is it for you working with the women in Berlin? Do you befriend them? Would you consider them your friends? And is it sometimes difficult for you to switch or to balance out the two roles of being a researcher and a personal friend or a colleague? And the second question is, have you ever witnessed an effect where your research changes the behavior of the people that you do research with? So if any of your publications have effects on behavior of the people that you are interviewing, maybe in the case of Berlin, because it's a very long period of research. I thought about this when you mentioned the Zeit article. Mm-hmm. But maybe also from another project.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, keeping this distance with the informants, it is a very hard thing, because not only like we spend lots of time together during these interviews and being in contact with each other, but also for some of my informants, I become a contact point with the German state. They start asking me about something, and they start, because some of them just don't have enough people to talk about something, and some are just they will rather ask me, a researcher, than go to websites and check what are the regulations. And on this occasion, it is the answer to the second question. I might say that yes, this fact of personal engagement have somehow changed the behavior of these people, because from me, they have known that they have certain rights, that they can, for instance, apply for something, for some more social benefits because they didn't know it before, or other things. Some people were telling me different urban legends about German bureaucracy. The example is someone ever told someone that if you're receiving Bürgergeld, you need to collect all the receipts for where do you spend your Bürgergeld. And I heard it from two different people, the same story. So I would say it circulated somewhere on social media. And I told it both of them. And one told me like, oh, I already have 2 shoe boxes full of receipts. And I'm so anxious that when I go to the Späti or to buy some vegetables on the market, I cannot do it. Please calm down. It's not like that. It's even if German state would love to control you like that, no one has means to do it. There is just not enough people to do that. So yeah, to this extent, yeah.
So one more question. At the beginning of the talk, you talked about that you collected data from online, from the internet. And also from social media platforms, or posting it on social media platforms, and Russia also being very present in the internet, especially in social media networks. Have you noticed any attempts to undermine your data collection, or would you consider this that there might be some false data points?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very interesting question. I should probably address it to my colleagues in Ukraine, because we didn't think about that. We were just okay, we're doing this. And maybe at the beginning of the full-scale war, it wasn't that much attention to this. But yes, we have collected some controversial data of people expressing that they are so disappointed of Ukrainian state and that they are waiting for Russian liberation. And it was one of the questions that we omitted in our report, of course, because they were not that, since the research was not quantitative, we couldn't say that there were not much of the answers like this. They were still there, but we didn't even think about that they might be a provocation from another state. Yeah, that's a point to think. Thank you.
So thanks for your highly reflective and insightful talk. I have one question on the insider-outsider dichotomy. Now I can perfectly see that the access is something where the insider gains an advantage, but it comes with certain responsibilities. But about the interpretation of the data, of what you make out of it, certainly context matters. You know more about the context, you know the language. But just as a thought experiment, let's assume me as a white male professor from a famous university is sitting next to you. Would, while you're doing the interviews, and let's assume I understand Ukrainian, would my interpretation differ from yours?
I would say yes. Thank you for your question. Yes, interpretation will, of course, differ. I'm truly believing that interpretation differs from every person because of some background. But that's why I value the co-production of knowledge that much. That's if we discuss the data together, it's the only way to overcome this bias, and maybe, also discuss the context, contextual things, like that something looks obvious for me and something doesn't look good in a translation for German, for instance, and how to present the data. And I would say any good research is produced by a single person, because it is a community thing that we do with community and for community.
It's a bit off topic because it's more about something that you stress. Can help notice that you always stress the fact the full-scale war. So I know that a lot of people forgot that the invasion started 7 years prior to the engagement now. Is there, now your insight in Ukraine, is there any like consensus when it all started? Like when the first green men arrived, or on Maidan, or with the independence? Is there a consensus among Ukrainians?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, I didn't mention it before, but it's how we say in Ukraine. It is unfortunately no clear evidence when the first green men arrived to Crimea, but we say that the war has started with the annexation of Crimea, and the date is for now 21st of February, I think, when there were some discussion about that it has been 10th anniversary of the beginning of the war. And that's also before that, in Ukrainian media, calling the war was more like a colloquial thing, because officially it was firstly anti-terrorist operation, then the operation of joint forces. And in European media and even in publications, when I published my previous papers, I couldn't say the word war. I was inclined to say conflict, as it was officially recognized by International Court of Justice, and it was a recommendation and the policies of Elsevier, Springer, and all the papers. Now we say it, and it's also a disclaimer before every publication, that we say it full-scale war, because the actual war has started in February 2014. And that's also what we are trying to do in every publication. Just insert this thought. Mm-hmm. And even now, the war is not declared. So, like, technically, in terms of law, it is still something like a Russian unprovoked attack on Ukraine, or what else? What other euphemisms can be? But it's still not a war. And in Russia, the same. They also don't call it a war. It's also the special operation. Special military operation. So there are two countries in war. No one recognizes it as a war, but in Ukraine, it's now everyone just says it, even though it's not officially, claimed.
If I don't see any other questions, thank you so much, Valeria. Then I'll also take a chance to ask a question. Thank you so much for challenging us to think about ethical co-production and for this very insightful talk. I think your talk, but your research also more broadly does a great job at also conceptualizing voice, and you illustrated that very well. I'm thinking a little bit though on conceptualizing listening, and so I wanted to ask you, what are your hopes for this research? So who do you want to listen, and how do you want them to listen?
Yeah, thank you for your question. It's the two different research I presented today have different audiences, and even 3 different audiences. So the first report we published in Ukrainian about this collective experience of Ukrainians, it was more to the inner audience, of course, to the people who are participating and were just interested in what they got. And it's also documenting the reality. like the first report we published, it wasn't that analytical. It was more documentational, and it is more about this outreach to the community of researchers. The second one that we published in English was mostly targeted to NGOs, donors, and people who are in power to help Ukraine, actually, like international donors who, yeah, and I really hope that it's had an impact, and it also elevated the status of our think tank on some levels. So we got more projects, and now my former colleagues are working on developing of community centers and doing very practical things in Ukraine with help of donations from abroad. With the research I'm doing here, and I kind of already had this impact. In case of Berlin, my main stakeholder is the Senate of Berlin. And I was already invited to be a wissenschaftliche Beraterin, scientific consultant in the Department for Women and Equality in the Senate of Berlin. And they found me because of my research. And yeah, it is probably, yeah, I was saying that, like, wow, it's a dream of a researcher to go somewhere and to talk with real stakeholders. I'm not aiming into changing the lives of my informants, but if their stories have can be recalled in the meeting with people who are in charge of these policies, that maybe it can be something, especially in cases of bureaucracy and yeah, housing, because sometimes the system, the state, and the people are just coexisting but not interacting even when they are supposed, because they just don't communicate on the same language and not exist at the same spaces at some points. And that's very interesting, maybe something we need to change as social researchers. Thank you.
I still have 2 more questions. So I have to admit, I'm an outsider. I'm doing research with refugees from Ukraine who are living in Germany right now. And you were saying that the insight that you shared could be adapted to other conflict-affected contexts. And I doubt that. You were saying that you think that usually it's really hard to get information in conflict-affected contexts. I would definitely share that impression. But just to give you some insights of why I think it might be different also with co-authoring, because I was conducting interviews with anti-military activists in Myanmar right after the military coup in 2021, right after the coup. And people wouldn't, for example, respond to Google Forms because they were too afraid, because I think the threat model is a different one. Because I think in Ukraine it's different, and maybe individuals are not that afraid because the Ukrainian state is not seen as a threat model. In case of Myanmar, for example, because the military staged a coup, the threat model is a different one. So I think also when it comes to respondents, it depends totally on the threat model. And when it comes to co-authoring, because I am still working with people in Myanmar and they're not co-authoring because they're too afraid that, for example, the military will put them in prison, will even kill them because of their scientific publication against the military. I think it might be a different case for Ukraine, but then I'm afraid of saying that co-authoring might be a good thing, because then also about the ethical reflection, we scholars might also put in danger or endanger people that we're co-authoring with, because the situation can change. In Myanmar it has changed, in Ukraine it has changed, and also like conflict is changing so quickly. So like the 2 questions, I think, or do you think that because of the threat model is a different one, also like Ukrainians at that time might be more open to respond? Also when, for example, Google is not really the most data secure platform. The second one about co-authoring, do you think that it's different because, yeah, also the situation is a totally different one? And do you know of scholars that also afraid of publishing about it now, because when the situation changed, can they go back to their country because they have been critical about Russia, etc.?
Yeah, thank you for your question. Yeah, of course, context matters, and it's always evaluating the situation, what it is at this moment, and also trying to think projectively how can publication affect the researcher, the informants, and the co-authors from the country in the future. And of course, here what you mentioned to me, it sounds more like authoritarian contexts, which are it's another layer of how to conduct research under authoritarianism. And yeah, I've also had kind of a similar conversation a year ago in Leipzig with other colleagues who were working on Myanmar context. And they mentioned to me the same, that people were too afraid to disclose themselves in any ways, but it's also relevant to other countries, Iran, even Russia. Those people who have escaped and who have families there, who can be targeted for that. And we know that this is what is happening in Russia with the families of those who escaped. But also it is this responsibility to study the situation and what is happening in the society under such extreme pressure. And maybe we can hope that the situation changes sometimes, and we will be able to acknowledge the people who helped us, who were participating in this at some point, maybe not now, but to keep it in mind also gives some silver linings. Yeah, and the second question, sorry. Yeah. Yes, of course. Also the question of authoritarianism and this like data protection thing and all the anonymization. In some countries, people just don't think about that. I mean, like also in Ukraine compared to Germany, if you are in Ukraine with Ukrainian IP address, you don't need to agree to cookies on every website. We just don't have it because it's another model of, also another way of thinking. And probably less people are really into thinking that, oh, this might harm me, until they trust the state and know that the state is not going for them. But also in the case that people are in Germany already, and I ask them to tell me something about their experience in Germany, like my respondents who asked to do the interviews off the record because of very particular things, like receiving Bürgergeld and doing some black market jobs. And they are aware that they do something not nice, and they must not tell anyone about that because they might be persecuted. So it's also a personal, the way people think and imagine the role of state and the potential harm they might get from participating in the research. And in some countries, like authoritarian regimes, of course, it's much more obvious, much more an obvious threat. And that's why probably all the literature is mentioning that this is a hard to reach population and all of this. But some contexts are just different. It's maybe also comparable.
Yes, thank you. I'm still wondering or thinking about your self-description as a positioned researcher. On the one hand, I'm thinking like, well, we are all positioned in several ways, everyone. And on the other hand, I'm thinking, okay, that also opens up for different possibilities. Is it activism? Is it, I don't know, just like opposite idea to Weber and his idea of like we don't care at all, or that's our responsibility as a scholar. So maybe you can just kind of elaborate what's your notion about it and what's your idea behind calling yourself a positioned researcher.
Yeah, thank you for this question. Yeah, of course, I would say that it is there are lots of intersections of different identities in doing research and doing like research in social science or political science, because even like the choice of methodology, a choice of literature that you approach, like feminist geopolitics can also be the prism through which you see the case study, for instance. With my reference, I mean mostly that I'm positioned researcher because I've done 2 research projects during the war, the full-scale war, one in Ukraine while still being in Ukraine and researching the experience exactly as I had. And now I'm researching, actually these 12 women I'm following are single Ukrainian women who moved in Berlin at the same time as I did. And this is something like they are too close to my experience. And this gives me this challenge and this material to think about how do I distinguish myself. And yeah, of course, it's also intersection of everything. And yeah, I would say I see it a lot even among the small research projects with students in social science who are also doing their small essays and small interviews that intersect and reflect their positionalities as activists, as like queer people, as people of certain nationality, of certain backgrounds, of course. It's probably it is inevitable in almost all the social research unless we are doing something with numbers.
All right, I have a quick question about the survey itself. What are like the biggest changes of the following up surveys to the beginning of the war, in the beginning of the surveying?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You mean the change of questions when we repeated the survey? Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, like the situation changed a lot, and we just adapted the survey to like the questionnaires from asking what did you do at the first hour, at the first day of the war, to a more reflective approach, like what were like reformulating the questions to can you name 3 most meaningful events that happened in the last 3 months in your life or so, and also less questions about like logistics, decision making and immediate needs, but more about like what is meaningful for people, what are their fears, and what are their future expectations. And answers changed a lot through this time, of course. And one of the topics that evolved was the fear of mobilization, for instance, among the male respondents. That wasn't an issue at the first days of full-scale war. No one was worrying about that. Everyone was worrying about what's gonna be with our country and with our lives. And yeah, of course, it's probably became more personal, like this questionnaire afterwards.
We're already beyond the time, but there's so many interested questions.
Yeah,
I think we'll take one last one because we're already over time. Was that okay? Good. It was answered. It was the same question. Then join me in giving a round of applause to Valeria. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, and there is my email here. So if anyone has any additional questions, just, yeah.